Any questions before we start? Yeah, so the question is, if you use multiple views for the same data, can you display them together? Yes.
The page size, can I use A3 which is it?
Like landscape, you can change it to landscape orientation if you want. That helps, yeah. Yeah. Someone also showed me a dashboard that they made in Tableau. That's fine. Any other questions? Okay, good, good. If there are questions, you can ask anytime. If there are comments, you can ask, make the comments anytime. We have no workshop on Friday, just so everybody knows. There is a, I did make a note of that on the Moodle page, if anybody ever looks there. Yep. Okay, so today we're going to talk about literature surveys and Coursework 3. So Coursework 3 is about writing a literature survey, and the goal is to have it connected to your dissertation too. So you're actually feeding two birds with one stone if you can get it to overlap with your dissertation. It's like starting your dissertation essentially. Little warning, this is not easy. Literature reviews are not easy. It's very difficult actually to do a good literature review. It's very difficult. So a little warning, I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible, but even with all the guidance that I give you, it's not going to be easy. And I'll try to explain why. But I think all of you have some idea already of why it's not easy because of Coursework 1, right? Coursework 1 is not easy. So the organization and the preparation for a literature survey falls into different kind of stages. I describe what I call preparation phases. These are all things that you do in order to prepare your literature survey. These are all the things that you can do before you start writing, or think about before you start writing. And then this is the writing phase. So there's like a preparation phase and a writing phase. It's not exactly linear like this. It looks step by step like a waterfall method, but that's not the way it is in reality. In reality, you're bouncing back and forth between the steps. Sometimes you're doing preparation, sometimes you're doing writing, sometimes you're doing writing and then you go back to preparation and vice versa. But that's sort of what it looks like. So why do we write literature surveys? This slide is supposed to describe, right? What is it? Why are these so common? So a new project usually starts off with a literature review. Right? That's usually a starting point. And the reason is to determine solved and unsolved problems. If we want to do research, we really want to work on unsolved problems. We want to identify an unsolved problem and then figure out if we can come up with a solution to that problem. That's the goal of a literature review, right? So the goal of a literature review is to determine the solved and unsolved problems. One sentence, right? Why is this difficult? Because there's a very large volume of previous literature, right? Millions of research papers. Keeping up with the literature explosion is identified as one of the top challenges in any field. This is challenging. It is difficult. And by the way, it's difficult for me too. It's not like just difficult for you, it's difficult for me. So if it's difficult for me, it must be super difficult for you. Anyways, it's difficult for everybody. Yeah. That's why I put this true everywhere. So the question is, how can we navigate through this massive complexity, and how can we determine unsolved problems to work on? In reality, you're going to speak with your supervisor to talk about this how to find unsolved problems. Yeah. So the key questions that you want to think about for your literature survey are, what has been published on this topic already? I have a topic I'm interested in, and you want to figure out what has been published on that topic. How have certain studies built on previous studies? Are there any controversies, debates, or contradictions in the literature? That's very difficult to find. Have pathways to future research already been suggested? Does anybody know the answer to that question, by the way? Already? I mean, the answer is yes. At the end of all the research papers, there's a conclusions and future directions section, right? So you'll be able to see future research ideas at the end of each research paper. This is something you can think about. Now, how will your survey make a unique contribution? This is really a statement, a question that you ask PhD students, not really master's students. That's a PhD student question. Right, you're not expected to publish your survey or your literature survey in this module. Right. Which methodologies have researchers used and which appear to be best? Who are some of the key researchers or leaders in the field? And how does your topic fit into the larger context of previous work? Those are all questions that a perfect literature survey answers. So a literature survey is a good way to obtain an overview of what has been done already on a certain topic, right? And if in this module, the goal is coursework 3. That's your goal, to submit coursework 3, right, to a high standard. If you were a PhD student, then your goal would be to publish the literature survey, right? And what we talk about today is based on experience, right? And supervision experience. And here's a statement, a very explicit statement about the difficulty. Literature surveys are difficult. It's just a good thing, I think, to sort of get your expectations aligned. Most people don't say this. They don't say, oh, what you're about to do is, or try to do is really difficult. I think it's good that you have that expectation that you're going to be given a task that's difficult, so that you can prepare yourself to put in some extra time to overcome the difficulties. Like, it's not just an easy exercise that you can just do in the last 24 hours, right? So why is it difficult, right? Why is a literature survey so difficult? These are some of the reasons. The vast amount of previously published literature, that makes this exercise very difficult because of the quantity. How do you choose a starting point? That's difficult too. Anybody know the answer to that question, by the way? You actually have an answer to that question. The starting point is when you pick a project in the project brochure. That's your starting point, actually. Or you work on some project definition with a supervisor. Deciding on a topic, right? That's also part of the project brochure, that you select a project and maybe you customize it, right? how to perform a search, right? How to perform a literature search. You all know how to do that already, right? We covered that in one of the workshops. So you all know how to perform literature searches. How to navigate individual papers. Each paper is complicated, right? Each individual paper, but you now all know how to extract the essential information from one paper. You have a strategy that you can apply over and over and over again. And guess what? This is the strategy I apply over and over and over again when I'm reading the literature. These are two difficult ones: deriving a classification of the literature and determining unsolved problems. Determining unsolved problems, you can look at the end of the research papers and find out what the authors suggest as unsolved problems. Deriving a classification of the literature means, okay, if you have a collection of papers, let's say you have 10 papers for your literature review, how do you organize them? How do you categorize them? Right? They should be organized and categorized somehow. And then how do you do that? That's a challenge. That's difficult, actually. So choosing a topic, luckily this is something you have help with, right? You're given a list of topics in a topic brochure. By the way, you might have your own ideas for a project. That's fine too, right? Just discuss them with the supervisor. They don't have to be those ones prescribed in the project brochure, right? So choosing a topic and choosing the scope. Now, this word scope, what does that word mean? It means how broad or narrow your focus is. You can have a very broad focus and a very narrow focus. As an example, like a very broad focus would be artificial intelligence, right? It's really broad. I'd imagine you said, I want to write a literature survey on artificial intelligence. You'd have like 20 million papers, research papers, fitting into that topic. So that's too broad. That's a wide, so we would call that a wide scope. Right, that's too wide. What might be too narrow, that's more difficult to think of an example. But like artificial intelligence as applied to optimizing my tea drinking process, that's probably too narrow. There's probably not a lot of literature on that. So the scope is, how do you figure out if your topic is too broad or too narrow? That's what we're talking about. That's one of the challenges. So if you're not sure, obviously you talk about this with your supervisor, but it's best to start with a topic that's too narrow. That's the best. Like the more narrow you can focus your scope, the better, actually. Right? You want to have a topic that's very, very specialized to start with, right? It's much easier to widen it a little bit if it's too narrow than to take one that's too broad and make it narrow. It's easier to broaden than to narrow. And that's that's going to be difficult for you guys to assess, right? How broad or narrow your scope is. So how can you even reason about this or think about this? It's when you're searching for literature, right? We did a special workshop on searching for related literature. If you choose a topic and then you discover, oh, there are 1,000 papers, I'm finding 1,000 papers on my topic, then you know your scope is too wide. But if you don't find many papers on your topic, if you only find 2 or 3, perfect. Perfect. Like if you find only 2 or 3, perfect. That's a great scope, generally speaking. You can take those two or three papers, you can look at the references to find more, you could use Google's cited by feature to find more, right? And then broaden it up to something like 10 papers, right? So the most common pitfall is choosing a scope that's too broad, too wide. Yeah. So your rough guidelines aim for 10 papers for Coursework 3, right? That's Coursework 3 requires you to include 10 papers for your literature review. In a real literature review, like one for a PhD, it would be more than 10. It might be something like 25 to 50, right? But for Coursework 3, we're going to keep it to 10. And don't forget to search for existing surveys or literature reviews. If you have a topic in mind, see what literature surveys are already published on that topic. There's a good chance that a literature survey has already been published on the topic you're interested in. Right. Okay, and then you include a description of your survey scope in the introduction. There's an explicit subsection in the introduction where you describe what your topic is, how narrow it is, how wide it is, what it includes and what it does not include. Like that's a special paragraph in your literature survey. This is just a reminder that this module has a playlist of lectures, and there's the lecture on finding relevant research papers, right? So if you need a refresher on how to find the papers for a literature review, I recommend revisiting that one, yeah, because we go through step by step. And by the way, in Coursework 3, there's a special subsection called Literature Search Methodology. So you have to, you write one paragraph about how you found the papers, right? How did you do your search? It's not very complicated. It's, I found this survey paper on my topic, I looked at the references, then I used Google's cited by feature, and then I use connectedpapers.com to find my papers. Like it's, the answer is right there. But you have to write that down. Okay, and then if you were going to publish your survey, you would write something like the contributions, right? Every research paper and every literature survey has some sort of contribution. They make a contribution to the field. Yours don't have to make a contribution, right? But for completeness sake, this is what a standard literature review or a standard survey would think about. So it might be the first literature survey on a special topic. Right, if you're the first person to work on a literature survey on a special topic, then that's a contribution. You might come up with a novel way to classify the literature, like a novel way to group related papers together, to organize the related literature. That's a contribution. And these literature surveys are usually a valuable starting point for new people to a certain topic and experienced people, experienced researchers who are interested in identifying the solved and the unsolved problems in a given area. And by the way, a lot of surveys and literature reviews are updated versions of a previous one. So as soon as one turns like 5 years old or older, it gets outdated. And you can publish one or work on one that's just a new up-to-date version. Some of the most popular, highly cited papers in the world are updates to survey papers. You can describe something called field challenges. So these are unsolved problems, generally unsolved problems particular to a given research direction or a research field. They're long-standing, general unsolved problems, right? Discussing the challenges associated with research conducted on a topic T, right? If you have a topic, maybe it's data visualization, there are generic challenges associated with data visualization, unsolved problems. For example, one of the unsolved problems in data visualization is large data sets, very large data sets, right? This is a problem for most areas of computer science. The data set sizes grow faster than our ability to process them and derive knowledge and information from them. Right, the same is true for experiments, studies. This is true for most scientific fields. Like size and complexity of data is always increasing. Heterogeneous data is a challenge, right? Data coming from multiple sources. How do you combine data from multiple sources? Time-dependent data is a challenge. Error and uncertainty associated with data is a challenge. These are just very generic challenges. You're going to find out more specific ones when you choose a topic, right? But these are the kinds of things you look out for. The cost of conducting experiments could be a problem, or expensive equipment could be a major challenge. Right? Observing phenomena directly could be very challenging. This is a common challenge. Limitations of existing hardware or software, very, very common challenge in different areas of science. And you will find out more specific ones when you choose a direction. Right, for artificial intelligence, what's one of the challenges? Accuracy, right? Trying to get accurate results. This is always the challenge in artificial intelligence, right? You're trying to process images, maybe you're doing some object recognition, and then the question is, how accurate can you get your object recognition? That's always the challenge, right? ChatGPT is one of the examples, right? How do you get the answers that ChatGPT gives to be as accurate as possible, right? We saw that they're very inaccurate, actually. So then the research challenge is, how do you get these to be as accurate as possible? Right? That's a field challenge. Now we're going to talk a little bit about literature classification. So imagine you have a set of papers on your given topic, and you want to organize them somehow, right? Imagine you have 10 papers. You don't want to just summarize them in random order in your literature survey. They should be organized somehow. And then the question is, how do you do that? There's no magic formula, by the way, to doing this. Like, the default order is chronologically. Right? You start with the oldest, and then you work to the most recent. This is a table. This is just an example of a table that organizes literature on 2 dimensions. So we have a table here. The table has cells, and in each of the cells there are papers. This is a paper right here. This is another paper and another one. These are all references to papers, right? So in this table, there are something like 50 papers in this literature survey. Right? The literature survey is called Visualization for the Physical Sciences. So how did the authors organize this? They decided to have, along the x-axis, the different sub-disciplines of the physical sciences. So if the paper is on astronomy, it goes in this column. If the paper is on chemistry, it goes in this column, earth sciences and physics. Right, so that's one of the ways. And then they looked at the data, the input data that each research paper is processing. So they have two-dimensional data as one of the categories, and then three-dimensional data as a category. And then they've divided those into static and time-dependent. Static means one time shot, like one sample of time, or static. And then the other dimension is time-dependent, static and time-dependent. So every paper has a slot in the table where it can be placed based on these characteristics. So for now, I have an overview of the literature of visualization of the physical sciences. I can see immediately where there has been a lot of work, right? There's been a lot of work done here in physics, three-dimensional time-dependent data right here. And I can see it and then say, oh wow, there's not been too much work done here. If I want to find an unsolved problem, well, here's a good place to look. Nobody's been doing work on this, or this, right? So it points to unsolved problems. Hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 table cells that are empty there, basically empty, where I can easily work on unsolved problems. Does that make sense to everybody? So this overview table points to mature areas where there's been lots of research and immature areas where there are unsolved problems. And it just shows you a picture right in your face. And that's what classification does. A good classification opens up these doors and shows you, oh, this is where there's been a lot of work, and this is where there has been no work or very little work done. There are colors there. The colors add another aspect onto the classification, but that's not important for this lecture. Right? So I just showed an example of a literature classification. How you derive a literature classification is one of the things that makes the literature survey so difficult. This is a difficult exercise. How do you organize the things? It's a major challenge. So a classification categorizes each research paper such that similar papers fall into the same group. Deriving groups, categories, and dimensions for your classification requires some thought. Right? You have to think and try to come up with some ideas. Of course, you could talk to your supervisor about that. That's usually what happens in reality. Categories are often based on subtopics, reoccurring themes, and data or metadata attributes. So in that previous table, the subtopics were along the top, and then the data attributes were along the y-axis. What are some of the themes or subtopics that occur over and over again? Look for those. Those are natural categories. Are there any natural subject-based clusters? Right. A tool called surveys can help with this. So we mentioned surveys already in one of the lectures. That is also part of Coursework 3 to use surveys. What are some of the characteristics that most, if not all, of your papers have in common? Right. Data characteristics are a very common categorization. Right. The input data. What does the input data look like in each research project, each research paper? It could be based on data set size. Right. If you're working on some image processing like AI, it could be, okay, I have this algorithm that works on, say, images of 10 by 10 resolution, or 100 by 100 resolution, or 1,000 by 1,000 resolution. It could be based on size, data set size. Here's another example of class. These are really good examples, by the way. I'm not showing you. These are advanced examples that have been carefully thought out over a long time period. So I'm showing you these examples, but they've been carefully constructed and thought out over an extended period of time. These are not just easy, kind of came up with them, in a few minutes or whatever. You're just seeing the final product of a long process, a long and careful process. So again, we have a two-dimensional table. Every entry in this table is a research paper. And then along the x-axis, we have different kinds of objects. We have 2D objects, curves. We have curves on surfaces. These are all curves, right? We have 3D curves and more 3D curves. And then here we have curves, but here we have surfaces, and here we have volumes. So curves are one-dimensional lines, right? And then surfaces are two-dimensional manifolds, if you want to call them. Everybody knows what a surface looks like. And then volumes are three-dimensional, right? They have width, height, and depth. That's the x-axis, and then the y-axis is steady data and unsteady data. Steady means one snapshot in time. No, there's nothing changing over time. And then unsteady means time-dependent data, data that's changing over time. And that's the input data, by the way. So I can look at this table and I can see, oh wow, there's been a lot of work done in 3D particle tracing for both steady state and unsteady data. If I probably don't want to work on that because that problem has already been addressed many times by other people before me. If I want to do something new, brand new, maybe I should work on something here, right? Nobody's worked on this area yet. Nobody has worked on this area since 1995, right? So maybe I should work on that area, and so on. So it helps point out the solved and unsolved problems. Any questions about that or comments about that?
Was there a reason that nobody worked on this?
Why haven't people worked on that? That's a very good question. The answer is probably because it's very difficult. Yeah, that's one of the reasons, yeah. But, this is something I worked on with a PhD student called Tony McLaughlin, and it helped us work on the unsolved problems. So we didn't work on this. We worked on the difficult ones that where not many people have worked before, right? So we worked in these kinds of areas, you know, where there's not much work done. So that's about literature classification. It's a short literature classification sort of introduction. There's also this aspect called metadata. A metadata example. A metadata is like figures and drawings and diagrams that show you something about the literature that you've reviewed. Is there some way to show me any information about the literature we've reviewed? So this is just an example, right? This is a research paper. That's what this tree represents. This is a tree. And now, this parent in the tree has children. And every node in this tree represents a research paper, actually. So after this paper was published, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 9 or 10 papers were published based on this parent paper. So it has like 9 children. And then after this child was published, another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 papers were published based on that parent research paper. So as you go up the tree, you get older in time, and then as you go down the tree, you get newer, more recent in time. And then we've added a legend here that describes the properties, the data characteristics of each paper. So if we look here, there's a paper on the line integral convolution algorithm. It takes as input 2D steady state data, right? And then one of its children does the same thing, 2D steady state data. But then somebody published a version that extends it to surfaces. Somebody published a version that extends it to volumes, right? Someone published a version that extends it to time-dependent data. So that's just an example of a figure that shows you how all the papers are related to each other in the survey, right? Remember, one of the exercises in Coursework 1 was to identify the 1 or 2 previous research papers that are the most important. So in this diagram basically tells us that. So for example, if I look at this research paper, I know that the one most important paper before is this one. And same here, same for this one and this one. They all have one parent. They're all pointing to one parent. That's really the most important parent paper out of all of the ones. There's another metadata example in Coursework 3, in the description of Coursework 3. And so this is a kind of template. Everybody here knows that I love templates and structures. So there's a template for Coursework 3 that you follow, a prescribed structure. It looks like this. You have an introduction and motivation. You have challenges. You have a scope section. You have a search methodology, a classification of the literature, maybe some metadata, and then paper summaries. Your 10 paper summaries. So you're following a special template again. These are all the papers that we referenced in the lecture, by the way. So if you're interested in seeing more, like where these examples came from, these are where those examples came from. This is another paper with a lot of literature classifications. If you're looking for more examples of literature classifications, you can see the Survey of Surveys that will show you lots of examples of how people have categorized the literature. Any questions about that?
Do we need to do the literature classification in Coursework 3?
Do you have to do what?
Literature classification.
Yes, yes, you'll need a literature classification. If you want a distinction, yeah, you'll need a classification. Any other questions?
Can we just take the taxonomy from the exist?
You can use an existing one, yes, you can. Now, then the question a good follow-up question, he asked, can you use an existing organization or an existing taxonomy? Yes, the answer is yes. With a caveat, the caveat is if you take someone else's, do all 10 fit in the same box? That one? Like they should be distributed a little bit, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense? So imagine you just use this one. You wouldn't choose this one if all 10 of your papers fit in the one box and then all the other ones were empty. You'd want them to be distributed somehow. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, I'll use a few minutes just to look at Coursework 3, so we can look at that now. And if you have questions, feel free to ask any time. I've been working on Coursework 3, the description. It's taken me several hours actually to write it up the way I want it written up. This is what it looks like. I guess I'll zoom in to make it a little bit larger. Yeah. So it's a literature review. I think everybody understands now. This is one of the starting points of any research project is the literature review. There are some aims, the learning objectives, which I might change at any time, but it's not that big of a deal. Choose a topic, right? You choose an area of computer science related to your dissertation topic. Then you choose 10 research papers and write maximum 2,000 word literature review discussing the research papers. That's the goal. And by the way, this coursework description is already 1,800 words. So if you're wondering what that looks like, this document is about 1,800 words. Summarize each research paper using the same template provided in Coursework 1, then categorize them. You may examine the methods used in the papers and include this in your paper summaries. So you have this finding research papers, right? That's something you all understand. You all understand how to find papers now. So I don't have to talk about that too much. But you can ask your supervisor and say, oh, what do you think would be a good literature review topic? And they may even give you some papers to start with. This is the ideal case scenario. The ideal case scenario is you contact your supervisor and say, oh, I'm working on a literature review. Can you recommend some papers to start with? That's the ideal case. Yeah. Because you want this, you really want this. It's not a requirement. But you want this to overlap with your dissertation, really. That's part of the goal, right? Every research paper you review should have a DOI, right? And then I've put this section here, extra help on finding research papers, right? There it is. Then summarizing research papers, right? You know how to do this. You do this in Coursework 1. Each summary is 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then you can also make sure that I put a little comment in there about type of evaluation, the different types, some examples of different types of evaluation. And there's a section here called Extra Help on Summarizing Research Papers. Right, there are things that you can look at if you need some extra help on summarizing research papers. There's the categorization part. You categorize your papers, putting the papers into different groups based on something they have in common. And then there are some examples of what some possible dimensions are. Provide either a table or a figure that illustrates how your papers are grouped and organized. And then there's extra help on categorization section. So you can look. There's even a paper on this, like developing a literature classification. You can look at this if you want more help. The literature browser, you incorporate a literature browser as part of your literature review. And you're using a literature browser called Service. We mentioned this in the lecture on finding papers, right? So that's a tool, and it makes a web page for you. And then you add all of your papers into this tool, and it provides a web page. Supplementary figures, you add a supplementary figure, right? So here's a supplementary figure. Here's an example. It shows on the x-axis the year, and then on the y-axis the number of papers that were published on that topic in that year. So for example, in 2001 there was one paper published on the topic of visualization literacy, one here, then a long time, nothing. And then in the year 2014 there were 2. In 2018 there were 4, and then in 2019 there were 8. So it just shows you how the papers looked like over time in terms of like when they were published. It's a histogram, right, of the paper's publication. So there's a section extra help on supplementary figures, if you're looking for supplementary figure ideas, and then list of references. Everybody knows about references. And then there's the literature review template. So you have introduction and motivation, the field challenges, the survey scope, the search methodology, classification of literature and organization, and then the paper summaries and the references. Look like fun? This is not easy. Not easy, little warning. So that's why there's lots of references and extra help. You can look at all of these. They'll all be helpful. Right. And then there will be a detailed assessment criteria. I haven't written up the really detailed one yet. I'll do that in April. But that's how it's going to be assessed. Questions or comments? Question?
So we're going to write the first section and then an overview how we found those papers and all this stuff, and then we're going to write the second section, which will analyze each one by one. Similarly with Coursework 1.
Correct. That's correct. Yes. Yep. Yep. And in your search methodology, by the way, there's that section called searching for papers. Search methodology. You can say like, my starting point were the papers, my supervisor gave me these 2 or 3 papers to start with. You can say that. and then cite the papers, reference the papers. Any other questions? Okay, we'll stop here then. Again, no workshop on Friday. And we'll meet again when the classes resume after the Easter break. You're free. You're free.